Nobles and courtiers. Nobles, men and women from powerful wealthy families, ruled most of Europe during the Renaissance. The most powerful nobles were kings and queens who ruled over vast areas of land called kingdoms. Kings and queens governed less important nobles such as princes, dukes, or counts who ruled smaller areas of land. An important noble had a court or an assembly of advisors called courtiers. These included family, friends, and government officials who advised rulers about government, lawmaking, diplomacy, and war. Nobles and courtiers lived together in magnificent palaces with beautiful gardens, fish ponds, and groves of trees. Court life was full of lavish ceremonies, including great feasts and jousting tournaments, which showed off the importance of the ruler. Town and city dwellers. Artists, scholars, writers, church officials, craftspeople, tradespeople, and wealthy business people all lived in cities. The most powerful city dwellers were the wealthy bankers and merchants. Bankers lent money to people for a profit. Merchants bought and sold goods such as fur and wool from northern Europe, spices from Asia, and gold and ivory from Africa. They used their wealth to build large homes, dress in splendid fabrics and jewelry, and commission works of art and literature. They also commissioned public buildings, such as churches and libraries. Craftspeople made goods such as clothing and shoes, furniture, cooking pots, jewelry, mirrors, and glassware. Others worked with food. Butchers sold meat, bakers made bread and cakes, and spice grocers sold spices, oils, sugar, and honey. Each craft or trade had its own association called a guild. Guilds fixed the prices of goods and set standards for workmanship, wages, and the training of young craftspeople. Guilds were also social clubs that sponsored parades, plays, and the building of churches and chapels. In some European towns and cities, guild members also ran the local government. Nobles and courtiers dressed in expensive fabrics such as silk and brocades. Men wore floor-length tunics or short, fitted jackets known as doublets that were covered by capes. Women wore long dresses covered by capes or coats that were often lined with fur. Family life. A typical Renaissance household included parents, children, and possibly grandparents. Wealthy families often had more than 4 children, sometimes 10 or more because they could afford to raise them. Most poor families had no more than 3 children. Not many of these children could expect to survive into adulthood. Birth and infancy. The birth of a child during the Renaissance was a time of much joy and celebration, but also one of great danger. More than 1 in 10 mothers died in childbirth, and many babies died quickly from infection or from unsanitary conditions. Children were not born in hospitals, but at home in their mothers' beds. They were usually delivered by female family members who were familiar with childbirth or occasionally by a midwife, a woman trained to deliver babies. Soon after the birth, babies were cleaned and then swaddled or wrapped tightly in blankets to keep them warm. They slept in their mother's beds or beside their mother's beds in wooden cradles. Childhood and adolescence. Fewer than half of Renaissance children lived to adulthood. Malnutrition, infection, and diseases such as influenza, tuberculosis, and plagues took their lives. Those who survived the first few years of life spent their days with their mothers, playing with balls, sticks, puppets, and other homemade toys. As they grew older, children of peasants and townspeople helped their mothers with simple chores around the house or garden and enjoyed games such as marbles, hide-and-seek, and hopscotch. Most mothers breastfed their babies, but wealthy families hired a wet nurse, a woman who fed the baby with her own milk. Babies breastfed until they could eat solid foods. Marriage. Parents often arranged marriages for their children. Noble families used marriages to make political alliances, while merchant families used them to form business partnerships. Men were usually in their 20s or 30s when they got married. They worked outside the house, farming, working at their craft or in their business, or working in government. Women usually married between the ages of 14 and 20. A woman's main job was to bear and raise children and look after her husband. Peasant women worked in the home and the garden, cooking, cleaning, growing food, and raising farm animals. Craftswomen helped in their husbands' shops, while noblewomen governed their households and agricultural estates. Growing up, older children were given more difficult chores to prepare them for adulthood. In the countryside, peasant girls were expected to know how to milk cows and care for the rest of the livestock. Peasant boys learned to farm and repair farming tools by helping their fathers. Peasant children did not usually learn to read and write. Children in towns learned a trade by helping in their parents' workshops. Some boys went to school to learn how to read and do enough arithmetic to run a business. Girls were not as likely to go to school or learn how to read, but they did learn important housekeeping skills at home from their mothers. Wealthy townspeople and noble parents wanted their boys and girls to have a good education. They hired tutors who taught the children how to read and write in their native language and sometimes in Latin. In Italy, boys and girls went to city schools where they learned how to read and write. Out of school, wealthy boys learned how to hunt and ride horses, while girls learned how to embroider, paint, and play music. Renaissance couples exchanged marriage vows and wedding rings in front of a priest and wedding guests, who would join them for a feast after the ceremony. A bride received a gift, called a dowry, from her family. The dowry was usually money, furniture, clothing, and in rare cases, land. It helped the new couple to set up their own household. Health and beauty. People in the Renaissance suffered from many diseases, some of which were dangerous or life-threatening. They got stomach viruses and food poisoning from spoiled food and dirty water. They lived with skin diseases caused by lice, fleas, and bed bugs in their clothing, hair, and linens. Infectious deadly diseases such as the plague, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, and measles spread rapidly, especially in crowded cities. Doctors and surgeons. Doctors in the Renaissance diagnosed illnesses by taking a patient's pulse and examining the color and clarity of body fluids such as urine and blood. For treatment, doctors recommended changes in diet, exercise, such as hunting or dancing, and better personal hygiene. They prescribed bloodletting, which caused a person to bleed slightly by cutting them or applying blood-sucking leeches to their skin. Doctors believed that bloodletting restored the body's fluids, called humors, to a healthy balance by releasing extra humor. Trepanning was a medical procedure that drilled a hole through a person's skull bone. Doctors performed it to relieve pressure in the brain and believed that it cured everything from headaches to mental illness. It was performed without any anesthesia. Surgeons repaired bones and stitched up wounds, pulled teeth, and performed bloodletting. If necessary, they removed tumors, hernias, and kidney stones. They tried to avoid dangerous surgeries because people often died during surgery or afterward from infections. Renaissance mothers provided home remedies for most of their family's illnesses. They made medicines from plants and herbs grown in home gardens and mixed them according to recipes found in books. If they were wealthy, families could afford to be treated by a university-trained doctor who charged expensive fees for a home visit. Those who could not afford a doctor could seek treatment from the less expensive barber surgeon or apothecary. Beauty and cosmetics. High foreheads on women were considered beautiful during the Renaissance. Women plucked or removed their forehead hair by rubbing it with a rough stone or burning it off with a chemical called quicklime. They also removed most of their eyebrows. Since pale complexions were fashionable, women applied white flour, chalk, or a harmful white lead powder mixed with water or olive oil to their faces. They then covered their faces with a thin glaze of egg white so that their makeup stayed on longer. Blonde or light red hair was also fashionable, so women lightened their hair with bleaches made from plants, eggs, and white wine. They also bleached it in the sun by wearing hats that shaded their faces but allowed them to pull their hair through a hole in the top. Renaissance men were also concerned about their appearances. They took time to groom their beards and mustaches and cut their hair just above their shoulders. Wealthy Renaissance women grew their hair long and pulled it up into a lavish hairstyle ornately decorated with jewelry. Hygiene. During the Renaissance, people took baths once a month or sometimes only once every 3 months. The wealthy bathed in indoor or outdoor tubs that servants filled with water heated by fire. Others bathed in rivers, streams, or in wooden tubs filled with cold water. People used soap and shampoos that were made from lye, which is a mixture of wood, ash, and water, and were scented with rose, lavender, or cypress. They applied hair and skin lotions made from milk, lard, or oils, which they perfumed with various spices. They also attached deodorant bags called pomanders, which contained amber and apples, nutmeg, rosewater, and other herbs to their belts. Renaissance cities. Renaissance cities grew in size and number. Most cities were located on major waterways and were centers of trade. Venice in Italy and Antwerp in Belgium were 2 of Europe's largest trading cities, with more than 100,000 people in each. Medium-sized cities such as Florence and Rome in Italy had about 60,000 people each. Most European cities were smaller with up to 40,000 people. The leader of the city of Venice was called the Doge. He was elected for life by the city's rich nobles. Life in the city. At the beginning of the Renaissance, cities were often crowded, noisy, and smelly. Narrow, crooked, and unpaved streets were lined with shops selling everything from food and clothing to spices and medicines. Above these shops were tall, narrow townhouses that leaned out over the streets, blocking sunlight. Waste was often thrown into the streets or into streams and rivers. Civic pride among leading Renaissance city dwellers inspired them to use their wealth to make their cities more beautiful. Wealthy families hired talented architects to build palaces and sometimes churches, while city governments commissioned them to build town halls and create large public squares. Painters and sculptors were hired to create artwork for these places. Streets were widened and wooden bridges were rebuilt in stone and decorated with statues. Ruling the cities. City governments passed laws, repaired city walls and roads, maintained courts and jails, controlled markets, and raised armies. Cities had many different kinds of government. Some were run directly by lords. Others, especially those in Northern Europe, were free cities whose merchants and guild members had paid their lords for the right to govern themselves. These cities were run by officials elected by the citizens. Citizenship was limited to nobles and to merchants who were members of city guilds. Townspeople who were not guild members and peasants in the countryside were excluded. The republics. Some Italian cities were republics. In Venice, nobles elected the city's officials, while guild members elected the city council in Florence. Over time, wealthy families, such as the Medici banking family in Florence, gained power over the city councils and ruled the cities themselves. City-states. As trade, manufacturing, and banking increased, Italian trading cities became more important. Some cities became so powerful that they began to rule nearby smaller cities and towns and the people in the surrounding countryside. These territories were called city-states. Nobles ran some city-states, such as Milan, while city councils and leading families ran others, such as Venice and Florence. Italian cities often had large squares called piazzas, surrounded by important buildings where the public gathered to watch parades, tournaments, and processions. Warfare. Renaissance city-states and their ruling families fought with one another for land and political power. If one city-state became too powerful, others would join forces and fight against that city-state to stop it from expanding. The nature of warfare changed greatly during this time. The knight and the mercenary. In the Middle Ages, noblemen called knights were required to fight and provide an army of soldiers for their lords. By the Renaissance, knights and their lords had different arrangements. Many knights were still dedicated to the ideal of knighthood and to fighting, but others preferred to stay home and manage their estates. These knights gave their lords money to hire professional soldiers to fight in their place. Renaissance knights and mercenaries fought on horseback with lances or long poles that they used to knock their enemies off their horses. Foot soldiers marched into battle with pole axes, long sticks with metal spikes at the tip that pierced the enemy's armor. The lords began to hire professional soldiers, called mercenaries, to defend their territories and pay them for their military service. These military commanders, in turn, hired and paid men from the impoverished lower classes to fight with them. In Italy, these commanders and their men were called condottieri. Unlike knights who were loyal to their lords and fought for honor and glory, condottieri were loyal to no one but the person or group of people who gave them the most money or land. Consequently, war turned into a substantial money-making enterprise. Fight and force pays. When mercenaries were not fighting, they did not earn any income, so some mercenaries prolonged feuds. In time of peace, although it was not widespread, some mercenaries stole money from unarmed travelers and threatened townspeople with harm until they gave the soldiers money to be left alone. Siege warfare. Warfare normally took place on battlefields, but during the Renaissance, cities came under increasing threat from siege warfare. A siege is an attack on a city from outside its walls, combined with a blockade of supplies coming into and going out of the city. The goal of a siege was to force the city to surrender due to a lack of food, water, weapons, or ammunition. Siege weapons included the trebuchet, a catapult that could throw 300-pound or 136-kilogram projectiles against or over city walls. Siege towers were wooden towers on wheels that could be pushed against city walls to allow soldiers to climb over the walls and into the city. New weapons. Renaissance soldiers fought with swords, bows and arrows, pikes or long poles with sharp spikes at the end, and crossbows. By the 1400s, more powerful weapons called firearms were developed. Firearms, such as guns and cannons, used the explosion of gunpowder to hurl objects, such as metal balls, long distances. The balls from an arquebus or gun could pierce a soldier's armor, while flying cannonballs could crush city walls and defenses, making cannons a favorite siege weapon. Cannons were also mounted on city walls to defend against attackers and attached to decks of ships to fire cannonballs against an enemy fleet. While laying siege to a city or castle, Renaissance military leaders combined traditional weapons, such as bows to shoot arrows at enemy soldiers, with newly invented cannons to destroy the walls of cities or castles. Trade and banking. During the Renaissance, making and trading goods became two important ways to earn money. Banking arose from trade and from merchants' need to store, borrow, and send money to run their businesses. As trade grew, banking became more complex. Trade. Renaissance merchants traded a wide variety of goods across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Many of these items came from the natural resources or raw materials of an area. Northern Europe produced wood, amber, wool, fur, and fish. Southern Europe had silk, linen, and wool, as well as grapes to make wine. From even farther away came Middle Eastern citrus fruits, Indonesian spices, Egyptian cotton, and Indian jewels. In addition to these raw materials, merchants traded manufactured goods. They sold Florentine woolen cloth, Chinese silk, Flemish tapestries, and Venetian glass and mirrors, as well as books and weapons. To transport goods from east to Europe, traders used the Silk Road. Horse and camel caravans, as well as ships, carried goods along this ancient trading route, which ran for thousands of miles from Asia through the Middle East to the Mediterranean Sea and Europe. The Silk Road was important to Renaissance Europe until Portuguese sailors in the late 1400s found a sea route to India and brought goods back on their own ships. Markets and fairs. Local trade was usually conducted at tradespeople's shops or at markets in city and town squares, where vendors set up stalls or carts displaying their goods. People from the city and nearby countryside came to marketplaces to buy food, clothing, cloth, cosmetics, and household items, such as cookware. Long-distance trade took place at fairs, which were large international markets held a few times a year, usually near important cities and towns throughout Europe. As international trade grew, fairs became less important because merchants set up permanent trading businesses in Europe's main coastal and riverfront cities. There they shipped, received, bought, displayed, sold, and stored goods from all over the world. Money and banking. During the Renaissance, city-states and the rulers of other states minted or made their own gold and silver coins. There were hundreds of different types of coins in circulation. Money changers, usually merchants who knew the value of European coins, exchanged different currencies so that people from different parts of Europe could do business with one another. Merchant money changers gradually became merchant bankers during the Renaissance. They were located in cities and towns where tradespeople and other merchants did business. People gave merchant bankers their money for safekeeping and borrowed money from them. Merchant bankers also created bills of exchange, an early type of check that could be sent to a merchant in another city to buy goods. For each transaction, the merchant bankers charged a fee and became very wealthy. Money changers worked in marketplaces and in city offices where they were surrounded by the tools of their trade, such as gold coins and scales. Scales measured a coin's weight, which told a money changer if anyone had tampered with its value by shaving or filing gold off it. Art and society. The Renaissance is best known for its many artistic achievements. Great artists created beautiful paintings, sculptures, and buildings. Most of this activity began in Italy, but it soon spread to influence art and culture in the great cities and towns of Northern Europe. New subjects. Renaissance artists, like the medieval artists that came before them, portrayed religious subjects in their work, but they differed from earlier artists because they began to depict many non-religious scenes as well. They sculpted ancient gods from Greek and Roman mythology and painted scenes from history such as famous battles. They chose landscapes and wildlife as subjects of their paintings. Renaissance artists also painted and sculpted the human body and portraits of individuals and their families. Altarpieces were religious pictures that were placed behind or on the altar of a Christian church to inspire religious devotion in those who saw it. They were often divided into several sections and framed individually. Renaissance artists sometimes incorporated the faces of patrons and their families into their artwork. Sandro Botticelli painted the faces of some of the Medici family on the figures in his Adoration of the Magi. His own face might appear on the figure in the lower right-hand corner of the picture. The artist as a professional. Medieval artists were humble craftspeople. During the Renaissance, the status of some artists rose to that of a professional. The public took an interest in art and a pride in skilled local artists. Such artists gained the respect of learned people, rulers, and church leaders. They were seen as talented geniuses. Renaissance artists began to sign their work in order to be recognized. When they became famous, they were paid well for their art. Renaissance master artists were usually skilled at working with more than one type of material or medium. Some, like Michelangelo, were great painters, sculptors, and even architects. Renaissance artists also designed medals, furniture, tombs, costumes, decorations for festivals, and illustrations for books. Leonardo da Vinci represented the Renaissance ideal of a universal man, a person who was accomplished in many different fields. He was a famed painter and architect who also wrote works on anatomy, mathematics, and astronomy. He designed early kinds of calculators, parachutes, robots, airplanes, and war machines such as tanks. He drew and recorded his many ideas in a series of notebooks. Patrons. To earn an income, artists hoped to be hired by wealthy people and institutions known as patrons. The Catholic Church was the richest patron of Renaissance artists, architects, glassmakers, sculptors, and embroiderers who made altar clothes with religious scenes on them. Wealthy families also commissioned and bought art, often portraits of themselves or their families. Some patrons established academies or schools to encourage scholarship and the arts. Michelangelo studied in one of the studios set up in the Medici household to encourage talented young artists. Literature and theater. Literature and theater were two forms of Renaissance entertainment. Literature tells stories with the written word. Since most people in the Renaissance could not read, books were enjoyed by a small and privileged section of society. Theater tells stories with spoken words and could be enjoyed by everyone. Renaissance libraries. In the Middle Ages, monasteries and universities kept books in their own libraries for the private use of monks, scholars, and students. In the Renaissance, rulers created both private and public libraries. Cosimo de' Medici opened the first public library in Florence in the 1440s. Other leaders in Italy and England followed his example. Although these libraries were public, they were places of study used by scholars and students who could read. Books were not borrowed from libraries. In fact, because they were still so expensive, books were chained to the shelves to prevent theft and damage. Translations and imitations. Renaissance writers and poets were very interested in the writings of the ancient Romans and Greeks. They translated their histories, plays, epics, and poetry, and imitated the ideas and style of these classical books in their own works. During the Renaissance, writers also began to write in the vernacular or local native language. Geoffrey Chaucer of England wrote the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, the language used in England from around 1150 to 1500. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio wrote his masterpiece, the Decameron, and several poems and romances in Italian. In the Canterbury Tales, a group of travelers journey to the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket in Canterbury, England. Along the way, each traveler tells a tale that highlights good and bad characteristics of people in 14th century English society.